Today we're joined by Jakub Ferencik. He's been a guest on the podcast before, so you might be familiar with him. He's a very intelligent fellow, and needless to say, we had a great discussion about his upcoming book, Beyond Reason. He has an expected release date of end of August, perhaps early September, and I do encourage you to check out his work when you get a chance. So, without further ado, here's Jacob. Hi, everyone. Today we're joined by Jacob, the author of an upcoming book, Beyond Reason. And that'll be the crux of what we talk about today, some of the ideas and themes found within that. But before we move on to the book, Jacob, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Jakub Ferencik. I am Canadian Slovakian. Canadian, I get my accent from my Canadian upbringing, but was raised for 9, 10 years in Slovakia. My background is in political science and philosophy. I just finished my undergraduate degree, and I'm aiming to do my master's in intellectual history. I have one book self-published, Up in the Air: Christianity, Atheism, and the Global Problems of the 21st Century, where I talk about some of the nuances with reasoning about two huge ideologies and how they differ on global problems such as anthropogenic climate change, nuclear war, animal rights, human rights, and all the rest. And yeah, here I'm talking about beyond reason. So we'll get into the weeds about that.
Mm-hmm. And, just from the title, I was drawn in already. Beyond Reason. Of course, the first question comes to my mind is what is beyond reason? To my initial untrained eye, it seemed like reason was the pinnacle, but upon further investigation, maybe there's some nuances there that weren't being taken into account. So the first thing I want to do and talk about is this claim you put forward that we have worshipped reason and rationality to our fault, and to the extent that we're seeing it resembled in politics and moral questions today, it's perhaps not optimal. Can you dive into that?
Yeah, I actually think this is a really great place to start because I think historically, if you really look at the first chapter that I have is about the quest for certainty. And historically, you see there was this quest for some sort of shoulders to stand on when it comes to an epistemology or a study of knowledge, where people were really basing most of their judgments on dogma, whether it was Aristotelian, Platonian, or religious for the longest time, at least in the West. I know that China, India had different ideas concerning this stuff, but I know embarrassingly little about the East and their intellectual developments. But when it came to the West, you had people really believing in dogma for the longest time. And Socrates, when he said the only thing I know is that I don't know anything, he wasn't really saying that he doesn't know anything about every epistemological question. Anthony Gottlieb actually writes that, and he makes a compelling case for this, that he's actually talking about moral questions. And you see that kind of theme throughout philosophy. David Hume also argued much later that moral questions are very difficult to resolve. And more recently, Jonathan Haidt, a cognitive psychologist, argues that as well, kind of echoing David Hume. But you see, there is this worship of reason. And I think that is to our detriment because you can even see it with contemporary issues, such as with George W. Bush. This is a person who was very educated at an elite school. You would think that he would make educated decisions in foreign policy and all the rest. But then when you see him in real life, um, you see him kind of giving too much weight to his gut feelings on issues. So when it came to invading Afghanistan and Iraq in 2003, we saw that he was basing it all on kind of a myth of pure evil, as Jonathan Haidt argues. Um, and so there are a lot of problems with valuing yourself as an individual reasoner who knows the truth. It's much better to view yourself as someone who is very likely wrong and kind of arguing in that uncertainty. But the problem with that, of course, is that a lot of activists can't argue like that. If you are an activist or a journalist or someone who really wants to influence change, you have to almost talk in that Trumpian, Donald Trump lingo or language, because that's how you persuade people. So historically, we had a lot of dogma, and then in the, of course, in the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, you kind of had some of that dogma questioned. A lot of philosophers were saying, like Rene Descartes, um, what is it really that we can know? And Descartes assumed that we can't know anything except that we are doubting. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And then you had Enlightenment later on, 20th century, colonialism being questioned, which was the ultimate source of objectivity, that Western civilization is the pinnacle of civilization. But then, of course, you had the world wars, you had a lot of misgivings by the superpower at the time, um, the USA and Soviet Union. And then now you have a lot of, in contemporary politics, the same type of issues with like people like George W. Bush, Trump, and maybe even more recently to be nonpartisan with Biden, being so certain of his positions when it comes to Afghanistan, to take something very recent. So we see historically there have been problems with objectivity, rationalism. There's been such an emphasis on celebrating it that we're really getting rid of the beauty of nuance and the importance of questioning your own views. So that's a brief overview of some of the motivations.
There's a couple of different outgrowths that I'm seeing pop up here. Do you think it's more of a case of reason failing us or us failing in our quest for a reason? It seems to me that perhaps one of the factors at play here is that reasoning is such a precise practice. It's very difficult because, as you mentioned, people tend to stray. They rely on things like gut feelings. They can fall victim to various errors in thinking. But reason itself, if it was imaginable to attain it in a more precise manner, would there still be a problem? Or is it just a problem with the way people have approached it? Maybe perhaps they're swapping in belief in dogma for reasoning. They're not understanding what proper reasoning and rationality looks like. Perhaps it's just an unattainable goal to begin with. What do you think about that?
I think it's a interesting distinction, and I actually didn't think of it that way. Mainly because I just have over the years become very skeptical of our personal ability to reason. Because, as you know, I had a background in Christianity, and I remember that certainty of me as a, 16, 17, 18-year-old kid, where granted I was young, but I also at that point read a crazy amount of books. And so I assumed that I was intelligent. And I read more books than a lot of people read throughout their entire lives, right? Like at that point, I was at like 100, 200 books, and a lot of them were Christian literature. So, easier reads, obviously, but some of them were J.I. Packer, kind of knowing God, uh, kind of more dense introductory theology. And I had that certainty, and I really, really believed in all the fundamentalist Christian notions about predestination and all this. And I remember how that felt. And so, and now when I encounter, I still have a lot of Christian friends, and I have a lot of friends with differing opinions. And I'm always fascinated by people and how certain they really are. So I just have in general a sort of skepticism, just because I meet people with completely divergent views who are assuming that they're incredibly well educated and all the rest. And I think it all comes from kind of an ignorance. But to your point, it is possible that we can be objective as humans can be. And I know that there's a few intellectuals that I really admire in their ability to do this. But I think in person, in private, it's impossible to be like that. We don't really speak like machines or robots. And if someone would ask me, for example, about my opinion of Afghanistan, I wouldn't really respond with anything educated at all. And yet I have an opinion. Or, with vaccines, and I use this in my book, I have an opinion, but I don't have an educated opinion. And there's so many topics like this where we kind of have these assumptions about the way things are, and we have an opinion, but we don't have warranted opinions or justified true belief, as to use a philosophical uh, phrase, about a lot of issues. So I would just in general really doubt the possibility of attaining kind of a personal about everything. I mean, some things like, okay, there is a table that I'm sitting at right now. I do have parents. Um, I vaguely remember the past day, the past year. I can talk objectively or as objectively as it's possible to talk about these things. But then when it comes to other issues such as, okay, so how do you know really that atheism is true? And so that's why I call myself, technically, I am an agnostic. And I know that even fervent atheists such as Richard Dawkins argue that technically they are agnostic because technically you cannot know much about the world to be really philosophically kind of, well, not authentic, but specific.
Hmm. Yeah, that does make sense. And I see a parallel here between the previous point you mentioned about some of the activists and some of the journalists and stuff like that. It seems to me that there's a phenomenon of a mirage of rationality. It's a lot of these educated actors, because a lot of them really are educated, they fall into this sense of security with themselves, believing that they have reached a rational or reasonable stance. And oddly enough, I've seen it before. Once they arrive at that conclusion, it becomes extremely hard to persuade them of anything. So the label of rationality and proper reasoning has been captured by them, but they haven't captured the true essence of it. I feel like a truly reasonable, rational person will be more prone to dialogue, be more prone to trying to understand the other side. But we've somewhat seen the opposite of that, especially in today's political and moral landscape. It's quite interesting, and
Yeah.
I wonder if that's part of the problem. A misrepresentation of just what reasoning and rationality is, and perhaps a certain type of false sense of superiority once you think you've reached that level.
I think so. I mean, I think it probably boils down to not reading enough or not having enough conversations with people who are different from you. And because I know that Robert Putnam has released some research on weakening face-to-face interactions and how that affected the emergence of right-wing populism in the States in the 1960s. So when people started talking less and less to their neighbors, you saw an increase in polarization. And I don't remember if it was just right-wing populism and kind of left-wing populism extremism, but well, I assume for at the time it was just right-wing populism because of Reagan in the States. But you see that kind of. I know that I know activists personally. I know some journalists, and they are very intense people, and for good reason because their job kind of requires them to be intense. But personally, it's hard to relate to those people because you just kind of assume so much that you're correct in so much, and as someone who I cherish nuance and conversation, I can't really hold a conversation for that long with those people because I just kind of say that, okay, well, when you come back to me when you read another 100 books on, I don't know, the Middle East, because it seems like an incredibly complex topic, and even scholars like Francis Fukuyama write about it in a way that is kind of expressing skepticism. And Francis Fukuyama is a Harvard political scientist who understands these things deeply. And even he, when he wrote for the Atlantic recently, I think it was, it was a very vague piece about how there wasn't really a good way to leave. And I keep coming back to Afghanistan, but that is kind of a good example of the nuanced topic that a lot of people have a view on, and I think that a lot of people don't deserve. Um, well, deserve is probably a bad word, but don't deserve. Let's just use it. Don't deserve to express that view because they don't have an educated opinion. But some people have to have an opinion because it's their job, or it's because they've just fallen into this epistemological trap of I know everything. The three articles I read must be informative. And I mean, with COVID, we saw this. COVID has been a year and a half or almost 2 years now of continuous epistemological struggles, and to remind listeners, epistemological, a study of knowledge, kind of knowledge-based struggle, where everyone's reading different websites, there's a lot of misinformation, everyone's kind of confused, is COVID the result of 5G? Is it purposeful from China? What do I read? How do I question? And that's kind of the purpose of this book, is like, if we assume that we are entirely reasonable and rational, we're not going to second guess our opinions. And we need to move beyond reason. We need to say, okay, I have a lot of intuitive assumptions about the world. Studies have been showing that we're incredibly influenced by our environments, upbringings, genes. We're not these independent, objective walking machines. We function more, as Steven Pinker put it, lawyers and preachers. We have an opinion and then we seek evidence to justify it. And we then preach it to the masses like dogmatists. And as Michael Shermer put it, another scholar, the smarter you are, the better you are at finding evidence for your view, because that's just how the internet works. You know where to go. You know to search for the New York Times, the Atlantic, and
Mhm.
so that's kind of the puzzle that we're in right now.
Yeah, and this phenomena that you've identified, we can distill it down to a couple of key factors. So, an unwillingness to engage in discussion with those who you disagree with or those who simply have differing ideas than yourself, a desire for simplified explanations to not be bogged down by the complexities of topics like the Middle East and whatnot, to feel like you actually know something despite not really. And
Yeah.
a lack of appreciation for nuance. Why do you think these things are popping up? I think it ties back to this quest for certainty and just the human desire to be in the know.
Yeah, well, I think it's that. I think, well, there's a few different motives that I think we should identify when it comes to our desire for certainty. There's existential motives, such as if you are just a random person, Joe and Sally, living in Kelowna, for example, where I'm now staying, there's you just kind of have existential motives for believing things like, okay, I believe that Trudeau's government is harming me because my neighbor said so, and I want to fit in. I want to have an existential kind of comfortable living space, and I want to fit in with my environment. To oversimplify that, we have epistemic motives, so we assume positions are correct because it's just comfortable explaining the world and having knowledge that actually fits within a narrative. So if conspiracies about COVID are correct, assuming them helps me kind of make sense of the world. So if really China made this virus and wanted to screw up the economy, I mean, that helps me because now I have kind of epistemic satisfaction. Like, I understand things, I know things, and we get a dopamine reward from understanding things. This is how social media works. So we know that, and then we have social motives as well. And I touched on that a little bit before, but it also extends to issues like, interconnectedness with other people who are completely different from us. So not just neighbors, social motives can be on social media and all this stuff. So I would identify these kind of three motives for believing conspiracy theories: epistemic, existential, social. There's probably much more, and not just conspiracy theories, but everything in general. I think it is a very natural evolutionary response to, you look in the shadow and you want to see something. And Michael Shermer has argued that it's better actually to see something in the shadow. It's better to be scared because the trade-off for being not scared is that you potentially, well, nowadays, not much, but back in the day when we didn't have that much shelter, it could mean that you are met with a predator or that you are stolen from. And even today, obviously, there's good reasons to be scared of the dark. Uh, but that's the kind of same situation of there's good reasons to strive to have answers, because if you are not correct, then you may be a sheeple, sheep people. You may be someone who blindly follows rulers. So assuming that taxes are stealing from me, and also kind of living like that and saying that I want to elect leaders who don't steal from me because bureaucracy is inefficient. Governments don't really want us, as in our constitution and the Canadian peace order, good governance. Governments don't really want that. We should have, as the states has, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because that's more libertarian. That allows more freedom. We have a lot of kind of answers to a lot of these types of questions, but then you have to really ask, like, okay, how much do I really understand bureaucracy and the government in Canada, for example? Because I have limited answers to those questions, but it's uncomfortable to say that, because on the one hand, it's humiliating to admit that you don't know something, which is, I think, a wrong thing to look at the world in that way. And yeah, and so I think it boils down to that these kind of motives we have and our desire to have answers.
Hmm. I agree with that. Now, this next thing's interesting. So, as a philosophy student, as part of your book, this idea is presented that philosophy is disappearing as a discipline in the public sphere, and you also argue that further, it's failing the public. Can you touch on that for a second?
Yes, I gladly, because I was a philosophy student, and I was very happy with philosophy in general, but I kind of look at in my book how reading is in decline. And so obviously you can't compare the numbers of literate people now with the numbers of literate people in the early 20th century, because that's just apples and oranges. But since the invention of TV, radio, and even the internet, we've seen a steady decline in reading. And I don't have the numbers on me right now, but it's in the um, it's in 10-15% decline, if not more, just in the past 20 years, right? So, and with that decrease in reading, I'm not apocalyptic as many academics are about this, because academics have been always apocalyptic. I kind of quote stuff about when books first started releasing, being published with the printing press. You know, academics would say that this is bad because there's going to be a lot of literature, there's going to be a lot of different views on politics, and we can't have free speech. It's going to cause mayhem. And actually, we found that actually free speech is the best thing you can give to society. And a similar conversation was being held about the internet. If we release the domains to the public, there's going to be a lot of child pornography, and obviously there is a lot of child pornography, but there's also so much good that comes with it. So there is kind of a trade-off, and you don't really know what to do, but we kind of have assumed, everyone together, that decentralized knowledge is really great. And with philosophy specifically, it's kind of a similar situation. Now knowledge is very decentralized. And philosophy, at least academic philosophy, so for people who don't know, is is very covered in jargon, just kind of steeped in phrases and knowledge. So you have to have introductory basic understanding. And also philosophy is not really like regular literature. It's based in premises and conclusions a lot of the time. It's very structured. No word is, well, at least technically it's not supposed to be. No word is supposed to be just for nothing. Philosophical writing is very clear, concise. It's supposed to be, at least, not with the older writers like Kant, Hegel, and all the rest. But I think philosophy is failing us because it hasn't been able to touch the public. The public, and this is what Alain de Botton from the School of Life has argued, who also has a philosophy and background in philosophy, that philosophy has stopped talking about questions concerning everyday life. Now philosophy is more concerned with metaphysics, the substructure of the universe, and it's no longer talking about things like happiness as the Stoics did. How do I face challenges with a kind of sober mind? How do I face the death of a parent with a sober mind? Nowadays, philosophy is just talking about things that no one ever has ever even conceived of, synthetic knowledge, a priori knowledge, philosophy of mind, post classic dualist, all these kind of positions, post-structuralist, postmodernist thought, very difficult positions. Even if I was going to try to summarize them, I'd always have to do a little bit of research before, because you just never are able to remember these things.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of that thing. And so in my book, I present I believe it's two arguments that are philosophical arguments for meat eating. And then I compare it with David Attenborough's A Life on Our Planet. And I say, okay, look at this. Here's philosophical arguments for against meat eating, Hask by Engel. And I mentioned Tom Reagan as well, another animal rights ethicist. And then you look at a documentary and notice the difference in your response to it, right? You see that the documentary is very well made. It has a soundtrack, it's narrative, it has video, it touches our emotions, intuitions. The philosophy is a little less interesting and intriguing for us because it's hard to understand. And actually, this was the most confusing and kind of disappointing part of philosophy, is that you're there and you spend hours and hours reading philosophy outside of the classrooms. Then you come into class and everyone's like, okay, that isn't proper reasoning, try to formulate that argument differently. But then when you go hang out with your pals at the bar, or you hang out with your family, you see that all of that is just kind of pointless, because no one really does thinking like that. No one. And even so, it's very difficult to translate just to the general public, like traditional philosophizing. And then people are also reading less, right? So you have all these kind of problems with academic philosophy. And I'm talking specifically about academic philosophy. My beef is kind of with, philosophy of mind, questions, philosophy of language, metaphysics. It's not so much with, the pursuit of the Stoics, or kind of like just in general, what the public assumes is philosophy isn't really philosophy. Philosophy is really metaphysics and the philosophy of language. When the public talks about philosophy, they usually imagine Confucius and the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus and stuff like that. But that's the easy stuff. And I have never had a class actually on any of that stuff. So
I too have witnessed a disappearing philosophy sector, at least in the traditional sense, but I've also noticed a resurgence in a different area in a slightly more casual tone. I'm talking about like with podcasts. So people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and there's no end to individuals like this. I think they're hitting at an appetite for the subject, and they've peeled away some of the complexities, like you've mentioned here. The traditional academic philosophy, very intense, and it might even be harder to read about it than to just listen. Because when you have someone on the microphone, they're explaining the concepts thoroughly, making sure it's at a level where the entire audience will be on the same page. That seems to be a more ideal channel at releasing and engaging in discussions about the subject. Given this lack of presence, though, in the public sphere, at least in the traditional sense, what types of consequences are you expecting to see because of that societally, if any?
Yeah, well, first of all, those are really good examples of, Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson. There's others who are really good at talking about philosophy specifically and psychology and all the rest. Uh, but, they get so much backlash from academia. So Sam Harris wrote a book on morality called Moral Landscape, where he defends a moral realist position in philosophy, which argues for that there are right and wrong answers to moral questions, and that's actually a very well. I don't think it's that controversial, but in academia it is and also his argument. So a lot of academics really took a lot of offense to the book, and they were saying, "Oh, he doesn't really understand morality," and that's like a typical response from academics all the time. Whenever someone who is from an academic background writes a book for the general public, it's always, oh, this doesn't represent our side correctly, and I don't think it does. I mean, it happened with Charles Dickens, it happens with C.S. Lewis, Richard Feynman, and other science popularizers. So I think that's number one, that there is kind of, whenever even Peterson wrote 12 Rules for Life, got so much from the psychological community about how oversimplified kind of the rules are and all this stuff, right?
Mhm,
And so that's the thing. It's an interesting, academics are, people need to remember, ultra conformist. Academics are insecure, regular people who have their own demons, battles, and they function on ego very much. You meet an academic, you meet pretty much an egotistical person. Very rarely, do you not have people with very big egos in academia. But yeah, what I see the problem with all of that backlash, and what I see the problem with people, I agree with you. I think there is a kind of a resurgence of people listening to intellectuals who aren't really based in academia that deeply,
mhm,
because people don't really listen to Toby Ord or William McCaskill, or Peter Singer isn't, well, he is, but he's not listened to at the point of someone like Candace Owens, or
mhm,
someone, Candace Owens, openly anti-academia, and someone like Donald Trump Jr. Peter Singer, one of the most influential philosophers of our day, and he's not listened to that much by the regular public. I mean, academics and people with academic backgrounds like eat up his stuff. But I think the problem is that we're gonna see something happen. I don't know what it is, because I don't consider myself a futurist, but we're probably gonna see more populism. We're gonna see more questioning of institutions. If academics aren't able to bridge the divide and kind of step down from the ivory towers and stop messing with jargon and start actually working for the masses, because in the end, taxes are funding their research. They have to translate their research to the public, and sometimes it's obviously, sometimes it's impossible. Chemistry, biology, physics, some of these positions we don't need to know, and the same with philosophy. Some of it, obviously, we don't need to know. There is a place for research that is academic, solely academic, but that doesn't mean that all of it should be. And that also doesn't mean that there should be the gatekeepers that are there right now. There's huge gatekeepers, and few people really talk about how really class-based the entire education system is. So there are problems, and I'm not a futurist. I'm not going to guess, but I expect that a rise in populism will happen, because the gatekeepers, the natural response to the gatekeepers, and 100,000 debt from an undergrad from Harvard, is that people won't go there, and then the only people that go there will be the people who have rich backgrounds, and so there's going to be a divide, and people will want to listen to Candace Owens versus someone like Peter Singer, who was educated at elite schools, because they've been educated at elite schools? Why would I listen to someone who has nothing in common with me? I had to clean toilets. Why
Hmm.
would I listen to someone who never had to go through what I went through and just kind of was resting comfortably doing philosophy in Radcliffe Square in Oxford? Because even as I say that, I kind of resonate with that actually. Someone like Boris Johnson went to boarding schools, went to Oxford, was a part of the Oxford system, and then goes on to be mayor and now prime minister. He doesn't know what the average person in Manchester or Liverpool is going through because he never lived that life. So why would he represent my concerns as a citizen of the UK? So I think that's completely natural response to the elitism of academia and the gatekeeping of academia.
Yeah, I think you've
It's,
captured
yeah.
that well. So at this point, I think it's time for the grand finale. We've talked about
Mm.
all of the issues that we've seen. Now, getting back to the title of the book, Beyond Reason. What is beyond reason, Jacob? What is the solution here? What type of argument are you putting forward as the remedy for the problems that we've talked about?
To put it briefly, people usually assume there's two options. Kind of this is the classic distinction: objectivity, postmodernism. That this is the kind of, you're either objective, you believe in objective values, moral realism, all the rest, or you're postmodern and you don't believe in truth. Everything is subjective, cultural. It's okay to wear hijabs in the Middle East. It's not okay to wear them here, type of thing. You know, each culture has their own moral values. I don't think that's the case. I think that we don't need binary positions. I think, well, in the book, I argue for post skeptical rationalism, which is a position that says that every topic is nuanced, everything is difficult. There's no such thing as binaries. Some issues are clear, such as some things are self-evidently given based in history, such as racism is wrong, slavery is wrong. Now, based in argument, can we really defend those things in argument? Well, in argument, you could defend anything. Utilitarian positions could defend the subjugation of entire people groups. So I don't think, and that is what happens. A lot of smart people actually defended racism because it quote unquote made sense. And a lot of academics did. I think every major philosopher was racist, sexist, and all the rest because they defended those positions in argument. So, but some things we just now believe are self evident. They don't really need to be based in argument, such as me hitting someone. Well, based on some biology, based on some psychology, and some philosophy, it is wrong to hit someone. But there's some questions that are very complex and that we don't really have answers to, such as, what should be the proper response to a pandemic? And we saw every nation pretty much having a different response. In retrospect, we will know. So that is the position of my book, is that we should second guess our views. We should know about the intuitions. We should know about history and how long we have come and strived for. And we need to move beyond these binary, I would say even silly dichotomies of, um, objectivity or postmodernism. Why? Why just the two? I mean, it's never that simple. And that's always the debate. It's always, Jordan Peterson does this. He says, oh, postmodernism in academia. Well, postmodernism in academia is pretty much only cultural relativism. And cultural relativism is actually fairly straightforward. In Afghanistan, historically speaking, tribes were the norm. So it's very difficult to translate a democratic system, and this is what Francis Fukuyama argues, into Afghanistan. And we see that now, 20 years later. Some people are actually different. That's not to say some people are better, some people are worse, but we just kind of function like that. Things are difficult, things are nuanced. So the book's argument is we need to be kind and argue in good faith with each other. And that's the only way we're going to move toward some kind of more harmonious, more pluralistic society, because that's what we need with populism on the rise, with extremism, misinformation, disinformation on the rise. We need to move beyond the classic assumptions that we've had in the past.
Hmm. Well, Jacob, I'm looking forward to reading your book. Do you want to close off with any details? Do you have an exact publish date? Where can people look to get this? Stuff like that.
hmm Well, I'm aiming for the end of August, so I have it all finished here. Just waiting for some like tweaking with the book cover and stuff like that. So I'm aiming for the end of August, but maybe early September as well. I'm not kind of a stickler for this. And when it comes to following the release, I think on Instagram, Jakub Ferencik official. That's Jakub. You'll see it in the episode show notes as well, probably. And my medium.com, I have a blog there, Jakub Ferencik, where I'll also post about the release date.
Yep. I'll make sure to have those links in the show notes so everyone can take a look. It was a pleasure chatting, Jacob, and
Yeah,
I enjoyed
pleasure.
this discussion. These topics are so interesting to me, and
Mhm.
coming away from this, your point is emboldened. Just the amount of nuance that we've talked about, it really is a nuanced subject, and that applies to many other things that are important to public life. And adopting that stance that you put at the end there, a more charitable perspective, being able to have good faith arguments, that truly is the way forward. And hopefully, your book can help us get moving in that direction, because the recent trends have been a little bit discouraging, and we do need an uplifting force here.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it.
We'll talk soon.